Is everybody ready?
Yeah. What are we talking
All
about?
right. So this is the Superversive panel.
Superversive.
I think we're officially discussing, favorite Superversive books. But we'll go over it briefly. I was told that you guys have heard it twice before, but there may be people who weren't here last 2 years, so we can discuss what it is briefly and then discuss it. But let's first start by everybody introducing themselves. You want to start, Morgan? And we'll have this one.
My name is Morgan Newquist, and I have a hanger on for this panel, so I may duck at some point. I write urban fantasy, and superhero books.
I will write anything that's not nailed down. Half of my output has been urban fantasy. The other half is space opera, murder mystery, murder comedies, and just plain spy thrillers. I have done everything that I can think to do. I have not done straight up romance. I am technically in the vampire romance genre if, you don't mind all the rocket-propelled grenades, the Vatican ninjas, the Spec Ops teams, and a few Hellfire missiles, because when you're dealing with vampires, nuke it from orbit, it's the only way to be sure.
I do mostly urban fantasy, but then I also do some post-apocalyptic science fiction. Say that 3 times fast.
What's your name?
Dan Humphreys.
Thank you, Russell. Is your mic? Okay, this works. Yeah.
I'm Russell Newquist. I'm the father of the little baby at the end. So if you're feeling sorry for him, go buy some books and help feed him. I write action horror, and I can't top Declan because nobody can. But just to try and stay in his boat, my book War Demons has Apache helicopters fighting demons on top of football stadium, fighting a dragon on top of a football stadium.
That was fun.
My name is Anne Margaret Lewis, and I write mysteries and science fiction fantasy. And he published this version of this book, which is not going to be in print anymore. It's okay. I love him anyway. Go ahead. Back to Jagi.
And I'm El Jagi, Lamplighter. I write fantasy, YA fantasy, and books on writing. I'm going to speak very briefly about the Superversive literary movement, and then we will turn it over to the panelists to discuss favorite books and other issues. So in 2013, I believe it was, driving home from BasedCon, my husband and I were talking about the state of what was being published at the time. And I had just heard somebody talking about the people who'd started, I think it was the steampunk movement. Anyway, I thought the idea of starting a literary movement sounded like a great idea. It just sounded so, impossible to me. I thought it was kind of funny. So about a year later, I started a blog called the Superversive blog. And I should say that Superversive is a word that comes from the essayist Tom Simon, who, if you enjoy essays on writing, he's terrific. Writing Down the Dragon and other books of his are available on Amazon. And the concept that my husband and I had when we were talking about it was that it'd be wonderful to have a literary movement that dealt with stories that had an underlying light that came through them without being Christian stories or stories that was like the main issue, but that you just have moments that lifted you out of your ordinary experience and brought you up into something greater or brighter, or made you think or made you wonder. And so I started a blog about this, and I was really almost immediately, a bunch of people got very excited about it and started writing articles for me. And there was a Superversive publisher at one point, and it's kind of caught on, and now it's way beyond anything that at first it went beyond what poor Tom Simon could control, then it's way beyond what I could control. But that's where this came from. And so Superversive is, if you think of subversive as changing by undermining, Superversive is change by inspiring. So that's our little opening, and I guess we can start at the other end. I thought let's start first with, and let's go through once and name one or two older books that you think of as meeting the Superversive standard, and then we can talk about all the more recent writers and more recent books. Kind of give us a starting point.
Are we starting down here?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
Okay.
Starting with you, Anne.
Sorry. Okay. I think I need more caffeine. Let's see. We'll start with Lewis. C.S. Lewis is one of, I was so happy when I married a guy named Lewis. You have no idea. I was like, yay, I get to be shelved next to C.S. Not really, but I just love this name. And, if anything I could be inspired by, it's inspired by him, and certainly like his space trilogy and the Narnia books and all that stuff certainly lifts you out of yourself and puts you someplace else. And of course you got his buddy Tolkien, who, they may have fought like cats and dogs every once in a while, but they had this same superversive inspiration. So let's go. So that we're going to go somewhat old, but also they had their inspiration in George, I think it's MacDonald. I think yes, his Fantasties and other stories like that certainly inspired their imaginations. Chesterton, who's one of my favorites, he's superversive in his certainly in his short stories and anything that he wrote. He's just if you ever read Chesterton, he's just a happy boy. I can't help but love his use of the language. He was a master of the English language, and I felt cheated with my public university education. I never read Chesterton. Of course, they wouldn't give me to him because he was a Christian writer. But once I left college and I read this guy, so where's this man been all my life? So if you've ever, those are some more older writers. I'm sure there's stuff before them. So go on.
I'm going to cheat and use a movie.
That's fine.
And some people may argue whether this is old enough to meet Jagi's criteria, but the movie's older than me, so I'm gonna use that as acceptable. The first Star Wars film.
Yes.
It's barely older than me. Can't know the year before I was born, but I think one of the things. The series has a lot of fans, and of course, you get into all kinds of debates over when and where did it go wrong and everything. But for the purposes of this panel, I'm going to note that I think the series got less superversive immediately after the first film. But the first film, part of its huge success, I think, is just that it was nothing but an uplifting story, right? It's an inspiration, farm boy out of nowhere, in a galaxy oppressed by this evil empire, comes out and, becomes the huge hero. And I actually have a hard time thinking much of anything that's more superversive.
I think probably one thing that popped in my head is a lot of Paul Anderson's work, especially like the High Crusade. I don't know how you can get more positive than it's converting aliens to Christianity.
How about Edgar Rice Burroughs?
Yay.
Hell, I'll even take Dorothy Lee Sayers, who
I love
supposedly,
her. Yeah.
who technically did murder mysteries, but they were really novels. And I can give you one thing more superversive than Star Wars: Indiana Jones.
Yes.
Because it's not the Force, but there's definitely something out there that is not of this earth, and it doesn't like Nazis.
That's a good point. That's excellent.
So this is way old, and I guess there could be a debate about it, but the first thing that came to mind for me was actually a poem. It was Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, if you've ever read that one. And I think, it's got a darkness to it, but in the end it's about a sister's love saving her sister. And yeah, I think that's actually a pretty superversive poem.
I'll give one example before I ask the next question. I think the Green No books, particularly the first one, Children of Green No, I can't remember if this is in the Julian Fellows movie version, but in the book, they look out on Christmas Eve and the statue of St. Christopher carrying the Christ child gets up and walks to church. And it's just it's such a magical book. Just the way they handle everything in that book is it's probably one of my absolute favorite examples of how it's ghosts, but the ghosts feel like fairies or angels, and it's really charming. Anyway, let's go the other way for the next question. And why don't you each discuss a little bit about how your own work is superversive? You want to start?
All right, I have two big series. One is the urban fantasy that is right in front of you, but the other one is a superhero book called Heroes Fall. And a really bizarre description of it that I like to use sometimes is that it is superversive Watchmen, and I hate Watchmen. I didn't go about
Amen.
I didn't go about this intentionally, but it's about actually using what immediately looks like a superversive story, the Superman of the universe failing, and telling a superversive story instead. And I kind of want to do that because I believe in the superversive thing, but there's a real danger I feel, and this is trending in the Christian fiction territory too, is like to make something uplifting, there are no stakes, like that everything is too easy, that nothing bad happens in the book, and I think that's not what superversive is. I think it's really the ending and the intention behind the writing that makes it superversive more than like the particular subject matter. And that's one reason why I brought up Goblin Market, because it's a little darker and in certain interpretations a little maybe more sexual and that kind of thing, but like the overarching story in the poem is about familiar relationships and that kind of thing. And so I would actually argue that my superhero book is more subversive than my urban fantasy series.
For some reason, I always wind up with people fighting against the forces of darkness en masse. My vampire books deal with vampires, some of whom go to confession, and yes, it hurts, and some of them survive off of the chalice from mass. This is my blood, and it works. I got New York City cops who punch demons in the face. I've got intergalactic cannibal hordes in my space opera series, and it doesn't matter if we're going to go down fighting, but we're going to take these bastards with us, is the general attitude, mainly because, frankly, it's the forces are good are going to win, and we're going to go down fighting, period, because, frankly, the alternatives aren't that pleasant. Death is better, just ask everyone under Mao. I tend to... Yeah, I write superversive, but that's because I generally view most traditional fiction as superversive. I look at subversive as a modern-day virus, but that's probably for a later conversation.
Yeah, pretty similar to me in my urban fantasy stuff. I think the hero being battered and knocked around and still getting up and being willing to do the right thing when it'd be easier just to give up. That's a pretty unfortunately common trope in horror these days, and I've actually had myself accused of being horror, with the exception of it doesn't end. There's always hope, there's always a chance, and you got to strive for that.
So, I'm going to give two parts to the answer real quick. The first part is something that runs through the whole of my main series. Kind of ties into the last panel where we were talking about spiritual warfare, and the setting is built in a world where I take Christian, but specifically Catholic, not theology, but kind of the mythology that comes with it as just accepted as true in this world, but kind of like somebody mentioned, using it as an RPG manual guide. And with that comes a bit of a sense of the uplifting from it, right? If you are Christian, part of our doctrine, no matter what denomination you are, is that we know who wins at the end, right? That's part of the underlying tenet of faith. But we also know that the journey to get there is the journey of the cross, right? So it's a hard, long path that takes us to that point. The second thing, I'm going to give a more concrete example. And back when we were still running a publishing house, one of the first things we did actually is we published a couple of anthologies that were we solicited stories that were meant to be superversive. So we have 2 anthologies that we built that way. Those are out of print right now, but the last remaining physical copies are for sale in the room next door. So if you're interested, you can go pick them up. My particular story in one of those anthologies ties into this world here. But a little bit of background on the story. I've actually had some discussions on Twitter. This has come up recently people are asking, my kid goes to bed and gets scared in the dark, at night, and what do you do? My solution was to give my son a wooden sword and shield to go to bed with so that he could fight the demons himself and be okay. And it worked like a charm. I recommend it. But I also wrote, that was the basis for my story in one of these anthologies. Is in that story, the little boy is sleeping in the bed with his sister in the bed next to him, and the demons in the closet are real. And little boy standing up to protect his sister, I thought was, again, meant to be very superversive and uplifting.
What makes my stuff superversive is the idea that there's always hope, and what it kind of really looks at is it's a reflection of the darkness that's in each of us that we combat on every day, and that how do we fight that darkness within ourselves, and it comes from a higher power, from grace, right? So that's kind of the underlying. I think that's really what makes something superversive, is that it is there's this ray of hope that comes through it, and you will have some victories in that when you open yourself to that there's something greater than yourself to fight for, but also to redeem yourself, or to be redeemed, to be open to that light and to that hope. And I think that's kind of what makes something superversive.
That's a good definition. I think the term moments of grace was one of the original things we said when we first got
Yes,
started.
moments of grace, absolutely.
So we've touched very briefly on older books, and we've touched on how the panelists have excellent superversive stories. Why don't we each talk a little bit about some of the other people writing today, possibly some of the people in the book club, the book sale at the moment, if you happen to know.
On page 11 of the program.
Who you think are good writers who touch on superversive themes or write in the superversive movement. Want to start it with Anne, so that we'll give Morgan and the baby a little more time?
Well, okay, I can say all of these guys. I really love Jagi's stuff. Even in Prospero, there's this beautiful ray of light, that it's just woven throughout the story, this idea of hope. And certainly, with Paxton Locke and any of those stories, they're Declan Finn's St. Tommy. I mean, he's just a rip-roaring good time. Okay. So they just all do beautiful jobs. And Mr. PTSD here did a beautiful job too. So, outside of this group, I'm trying to, I've read so many people. Gosh, we haven't really. I mean, my friend Karina Fabian does. She's just funny. All right, so she actually does where she has a dragon detective, who solves mysteries with a fairy. Basically he's from the fairy world, and there's a fairy version of the church there, and he's got a nun who works with him, and they solve crime. And it's just, it's funny, but it also there's that sense that there's darkness in the world that you have to combat. And I think that's, the sense of hope, but you can also laugh at the same time, which is really good.
I swear I'm not just kissing ass when I say this. I think the most superversive author alive is the husband of our illustrious moderator.
Oh,
I was
yes,
hoping
John.
you would
Oh, my
mention
gosh,
him.
John Wright.
Mr.
Absolutely.
John C. Wright. If you're not familiar with his work, you should be. It is a real shame that man is not one of the best-selling authors in our country.
It is.
His
It's
work
tragic.
is fantastic. This one may be out of print because the poor guy has been through too many publishing houses that have had trouble. I don't know anything about that. But one particularly superversive example from his writing is a anthology of his own stories that he published called A Book of Feasts and Seasons, where each story was
It is
based
available.
around
I want that.
each story was based around a holy day. There's one for Easter and Christmas, but other days in there. I challenge you, no matter how manly you think you are, to read the story. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus, without crying. If you can do that, you are not human. It is one of the most powerful things I've ever read in my life. It's amazing.
A really brief aside about the superversive good effect on the world. My husband used to believe that he shouldn't put any religious ideas into his writing. And he wrote that short story. I think he only published it on his blog. And somebody wrote him who'd lost a child, and it helped bring them back to God. And it changed his whole view of writing.
So I've got a curveball, and I would say, Jagi, I think Superversive is actually more mainstream than you might even think, but Dean Koontz, especially his most recent stuff, all has a very strong thread of that sort of thing, even to the point where a lot of the antagonists are very definitively subversive people. They're trying to tear down moral structures and the society in a very negative way. And I definitely agree with Russ about John. When I did a review of Somewhether, I basically said it was like Dean Koontz channeling H.P. Lovecraft. So if you haven't read that, I would pick it up. It's a great book.
There's no synopsis that does that book justice. It is insane in the best possible way.
I hope Declan, as our reviewer, that you can mention a number of titles.
On page 5 of your program, you will see a review site. I run the review site. So, yeah, I have a few books. If you look up a guy named N.R. or Nate LaPointe, that's L.A. Point, you will find a book called Chalk. It's basically Catholic schoolgirl versus H.P. Lovecraft, and when she falls down the rabbit hole, it goes straight to Dante's Inferno, where the final shootout basically involves the Knights of the Round Table using lightsabers versus a eldritch horror that's in the shape of a cathedral. And yes, the roads in hell are paved with the skulls of bishops. Yes, he did not make that up. He stole that from a saint. Probably a few. If,
Disagree.
there is another ad in here for a book by Michael Gallagher. Body and Blood, I believe it is. And it's basically in the near future of 2060, 2090. It's not quite dystopian yet, and the local project kind of hosts gangbangers who are making deals with the wrong things that have entered this world, and it's, the local Orthodox priest, the local Catholic priest from Africa who has a flak jacket, the local combat exorcist, because demons are so common, every priest is an exorcist, and it involves the local biker gang fighting the forces of darkness. So, fun. I can also recommend Nate LaPointe's Dinosaur Warfare books, which are about as gonzo as you think it might be from the title, and it's probably more so. Yes, I do recommend the books of everybody on this panel, even Morgan, when she comes back. Actually, I have read her stuff. Her superhero stuff. It is still published, right? Good. Go out, get Heroes Fall. It's awesome. It is the best superhero novel you will ever read. Period and stop. Her current series, Summer Storm, I forget what the Neighborhood Watch series, is Buffy versus the HOA. Yes, the HOA is evil. Who is surprised? So
They won't let me build a fence. No.
yeah, it's like some of them are werewolves.
Keep the demons out. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
16
those
Benedict
are a
medals in the floor.
few people I can say. Oh, Rob Croce. Read his book, The Big Sheep. I have not read the follow-up, The Last Iota, but The Big Sheep is deceptively philosophical as well as entertaining. It basically like Terry Pratchett. It starts off funny, ha, and then it ends with a philosophical 2x4 between the eyes. So,
Can we actually mention also Jim Butcher, maybe?
oh,
Yeah.
well, I figure everybody knows. Jim Butcher, Larry Correa, Timothy Zahn.
Timothy Zahn, Tim Powers.
Kevin J. Anderson, if they need boosts from us, we're
They
screwed.
really don't, but yes,
But they do fit.
they do
Yeah,
fit.
they do.
Morgan, are you up for talking?
Here, what I can
Or...
do is
Let
I
me
can hold
really
my mic.
briefly mention one or two others, and then I'll pass it to Morgan for another moment or two. Both Hans Schantz and Carl Gallagher, who are in the, you can buy their books right over here. I feel are part of our movement. I really like Pure Poison by Hawkins Austin, which is a story about a girl who has been dead for 50 years and comes back to Tennessee and doesn't really know anything about the modern world and has to figure out, why she's back and what's going on with that. Steve Johnson is World War II elves and fairies fighting Nazi demons or whatever they are, and they actually go fight in hell after that.
While you're thinking. For those of you who have not read Carl Gallagher, you should be. He is basically, if you want somebody who does, David Weber back before David Weber became Game of Thrones with 500 starships, and names you can't track, because I had that problem. You read Carl. He doesn't need to describe Weber's loads of missiles. Both of his space operas are solid, epic, and brilliantly written. And frankly, I really wish I could put together. Oh, good, you have this microphone. I can stop talking.
One more before you go on. Can you mention your publisher, whose last name I don't know how to pronounce, but who I think needs to be mentioned?
Paulinelli?
Yeah. I pronounce it differently because I read it and never hear it, and I know I do it wrong.
His name is pronounced Paulinelli. No, he did not write the Aragon novels.
That's Richard Bond. Go ahead.
I'm just going to take a moment to shout out some of our other. So, Silver Empire was not specifically a Superversive publisher, but everybody that we took on that we thought had excellent novels, and a lot of them were Superversive. And I believe some of these are back in print with new publishers, and some of them are not. But anything that Benjamin Chia writes,
Yes.
he also writes under Kaiwai Chia. We had an author named Philip Ligon, and he wrote a steampunk. It's a steampunk series, but it's like steampunk fantasy with lots of like serious Anglican undertones, and it was one of the favorite things that we published. And he also writes some YA stuff that's great for boys, like airships and adventure and that kind of thing. Actual boy-focused YA. And I'm trying to think if John Mollison.
So I was about to say.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
J.D. Cohen.
Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
If you haven't read anything by Ben Chia,
Yeah.
you're missing out.
Trying to think if I'm forgetting anybody else.
I'm
Major
sure we
from our
are.
list, we are, but
I'm sure
yeah.
we are.
Yeah, Ben has been nominated for a Hugo Award. Don't hold that against him.
Is there anything else the panelists would like to say on this subject? Otherwise, I'll open it for questions.
How much time we got?
We have about 15 minutes, so we
Okay.
can say a little more if you'd like.
I can't think of anything right now. So why don't we take questions? I think questions. would be
So it's
good.
open for questions, and I'll ask the panelists another question if you guys don't have any. Questions or recommendations? If there are books you think that people who like Superversive works would enjoy.
Going once, going twice.
Yeah, we got one.
Relationship between the subversive thing you were speaking of. I got reading subversive. But there's before they talk about the Lewis and Fulton, like mythopoetic, mythopedic, mythosomething.
I think it's mythopoetic. I will kind of answer the question in a slightly broader terms and say that there are a bunch of different movements that are somewhat similar. Noble Bright tends and which is a reaction to Grimdark, and there's one called I think Human Wave, and so there's a bunch of different sort of sister movements all going the same direction. And I don't know that there's really a great deal of difference between, I mean, there's certain specifics in some cases,
Branding.
but it's Superversive is more of an approach, you know? And so we, under our, like, Richard has a website where he lists like 100 Superversive authors, and you know, a number of them are just older authors that write good stories. we've embraced, but they have no idea they're a member of our group because they were, you know, long gone before we came along. But basically, anything that's got good storytelling and perhaps a glimmer of light or grace in it falls under the category that we are trying to promote, but we're not drawing the lines very tightly. So a lot of these different sister movements kind of overlap, and we're all kind of going the same place. Branding is basically a good.
If I can, sorry, go ahead. Right,
Yeah.
right.
Joseph Campbell.
I think that's more, you could take that and write something bright. You could take that and write something dark. So you may see a hero's journey qualities in some of the Superversive works, but it's not exclusively that.
Right. Yes. So I think you when we talk about superversive, it is you got the word subversive, right? It's superversive is in response to subversive. Subversive, they try to undermine the culture and to show that it's hopeless. It's almost nihilistic in its tone. That's what subversive is.
Almost.
It is. All right, it is. Okay, I'm not going to say almost. It is. I shouldn't give the qualifier. Superversive is the opposition to that. It is a show that we are here to support or to uplift the culture rather than to subvert it. So, yes. No, good, good, functional. Yeah, I think that's a good
The
way.
only culture the left has is yogurt, which is a bacterial culture.
Okay, yeah.
So I'll actually I'll take an answer to that, because
Western culture has that.
another answer as far as what is superversive that I could have gone back to a much older one, and I actually think that I may have been wrong earlier, that this one might be the most superversive example you could think of, is Arthurian saga. And if you look at that, in a way, that almost is the basis for a large portion of Western culture. It's not just building it up; it defined it in a lot of ways. But it's not about tearing down the culture. It's not about destroying the old ideas. It is about the ideas that Western culture, and specifically Anglo culture in this case, was based on for centuries of, you know, things built into that tale, like might does not make right, and you know, noble service, and the hunt for the Holy Grail. Even, you know, those things are just woven into. I mean, even people who have never heard of the Holy Grail, the inspiration of wanting to strive for that was a part of the Western culture for centuries. And that's exactly the kind of thing that subversive fiction is trying to tear down, usually. So I don't know that it even necessarily. I think in the case of this movement, I think we would say that it applies to Western culture specifically, but I don't know that it's a specific Western culture that really matters, other than, as people already mentioned, functional culture, right? There
And
is definitely a thing of functional and dysfunctional culture, and we all know it, or we wouldn't be here at BasedCon.
Right.
There's
And-
actually a Chinese television show I like that I would say was kind of Taoist superversive. So it can go beyond, but even the other religions, the other parts of the world that are long lasting, have a very strong moral core to them, and that's what the subversive is often knocking down.
Right, and if you look at, he was talking about Arthurian legends, someone like Marion Zimmer Bradley who approached Miss of Avalon, that's subversive,
Yeah.
right? It was meant to, it was
Subversive,
it
that's
it was
deeply so.
it's deeply subversive, and it attacked that, Arthurian legend. It really did. It kind of destroyed it, So, of course, there are people who wouldn't believe that, but I do. So, and
We have a question been waiting back here.
no,
No, it doesn't have to. Answer your first question. Dystopias. Yes, of course. They can do it.
Marina is a good
Marina
example.
Fontaine, she's Jewish, and she wrote a dystopian superversive book. What's the name of it? I forget off the top of my
Chasing Freedom.
Chasing Freedom. Chasing Freedom. I do recommend it.
Well, if I identify your costume correctly, Terry Goodkind had basically a dystopian world. Yes, I recognize the more cis costume. I remember it being read, but whatever. Had an entire book where, his hero gets taken into the evil empire and he brings hope into it in basically by building a statue, yelling at the crowd and pissing off everybody. So yeah, but it depends on who's doing this dystopia. I've done a dystopia with a co-author who hasn't talked to me about book 3, which is why there isn't one. But to have something completely and utterly hopeless, most traditional publishers call realistic. Problem. Reality has hope. Otherwise, people would just off themselves and be done with it. If there is no hope, it's not real. It's even, yeah.
And it doesn't sell either, no,
Yeah.
as we certainly finding out, yeah.
And as far as, is it Christian? No. Look, Superversive, good is good and evil is evil. And, you take the sword, you stick it through Mordred, the sun shines through when you pull it out again, and he's dead. The problem is with a lot of traditional publishing, a lot of the subversive nonsense is they also have good versus evil, only they call evil good and good evil, and that's the problem. It doesn't even have to be a specifically religious context, because every culture has rules regarding worship of deities, how you approach your parents, laws on murder, laws on stealing and property rights. They don't call them the 10 Commandments, but there's some variation that, they have laws about them. And guess what? We all kind of follow them. It's usually considered good versus evil, and they're usually the laws on the books, no matter whether or not they're enforced.
I think you can have a moment of grace without the storyteller ever saying where the grace is coming from. And as I mentioned, there's what I think of as Taoist superversive story.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up Benjamin Chia again because he is from Singapore, and I actually am not sure what exactly his personal beliefs are, but
It's some kind of Buddhism.
but he writes from a very Eastern point of view. And in his superhero books that were originally published with us, but I think they're coming out again, with his superhero is the whole book is an interplay between Christianity and Buddhism and karma and being a superhero. And I think he's a really good example of that you can do Superversive and have it not be Western and not be Christian, because Benjamin is neither.
Answering the other part of the question real quick, dystopian, and this one happens to be a Christian example. I'm a little surprised my wife didn't already mention it. Movie came out a decade or so ago, The Book of Eli.
Oh yeah.
Is a perfect example of a very dystopian but also very subversive story. And one of the ones that's a little tricky about it because it doesn't really look like a subversive story until you get to the very end.
I think it still needs to be subversive, even if not if some of the individual installments in it are not. Like if it's one installment, it feels like it starts to undermine a little bit, and then the off at the end in a pretty dark place, but then he was able to like rise to the challenge and try and open it in the next episode.
Yeah, my very first example, Star Wars, the original trilogy, right? I wouldn't call it subversive, but I would not call The Empire Strikes Back superversive. It has elements in it that are that, but that's not a movie that ends in a happy place, right? But that first trilogy, you get back to the end, and you get Darth Vader's redemption at the end of Jedi, and all of that. I absolutely think you would call that first trilogy subversive.
Ultimately, yeah.
Ultimately,
And to a degree, if you look at a series as a whole story, you can have a subversive story that sections of it, things get worse and worse.
Yeah, it doesn't
Yeah.
mean that bad can't win at some point, but the idea is that good ultimately triumphs, and I think that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, there's a Save the Cat concept called the Dark Night of the Soul.
Yeah.
And that's when everything in the story is at the lowest point, and it looks like the hero is going to lose, and that there's nothing that you can do, and everything is over. And then the inspiration comes from overcoming that, coming out of the dark night of the soul, and on to victory. And I'm a big believer that if it's not hard, in even the sense if it doesn't get really dark, then that lessens the victory at the end, so that you can actually have something that's superversive that trends almost into like grim, dark, nihilist territory, as long as the end of it is overcoming that and coming to a victory that is superversive.
That talk, sometimes it's good to put in context, what you hate. And so, I mean, this is a reaction to the garbage we're constantly bombarded by. To hear from you, what's the subversive piece of content you all each hate the most?
Oh, gosh. Let's start on that so I can think about this now.
Watchmen, which is why I wrote the opposite of it.
I have to tell a very brief Watchmen story. My husband and I loved Watchmen. I read it and I just thought it was the most wonderful thing. I spent hours and hours looking over everything in it. My husband went to see the movie and I was at home because he was about to be born. So, I mean, it was my due date. So I didn't go to the movie. And we both came to the realization that Watchmen was awful at the same time, even though he was in the movie theater and I was at home. And when we met up, we found out we were in agreement. I don't know that I hate it per se, but if I had to pick something that I felt like I was the counter to, I once wrote a blog article about how I was picking up C.S. Lewis's Gauntlet to face off against Philip Pullman. So I would say that he's the... I really liked his first book, and I'm still waiting for the sequel to that book because nothing he wrote after that had any of the qualities I liked in the first book. But I would think of the Dark Materials books as kind of the anti-subversive books for my particular genre.
Well, Pullman said he wanted to be the anti-Narnia,
Yeah, so
which I'm not sure he pulled that off because he'd have to be as good as C.S. Lewis
I should
to do
say,
that.
and the Magicians. If you take Pullman and the Magicians, I'm like the anti to those.
Let's see. Things I hate. Anytime where it's, here is the evil, look, everybody is morally gray or neutral. Here is the obvious Christian stand-in. And he is obviously evil because he is the only Christian. Or he's the only religious person. I freaking hate that trope.
Law and Order.
Yeah, Law and Order, where they have killed more abortionists than have ever been assassinated in real life. More abortion clinics have been blown up in New York on Law and Order than have ever been blown up in real life. It's like, we don't have that much real estate, guys. I hate to break it to you. Especially since they never leave the island of Manhattan. And, oh God, history. Just, I'm sorry, I've got a master's in history. And Dan Brown was reaching popularity about the time I got my master's degree. And I wrote 5 books on basically, well, if this guy can write a crappy novel with a bunch of lies, I can write a good thriller with actual real history. So, anyway, those things irk me, and it's like, guys, when you're doing your history, can you at least try, even just do a 5-minute search on Wikipedia? Maybe it's a 50-50 chance it'll be real, which is a better shot than what we've been getting lately on television, or most media.
I think most modern horror, and the one that particularly jumps to mind for me is a guy named Nick Cutter. He kind of combines the worst non-ending that John Carpenter likes to do with just absolutely just being plain mean-spirited. And it was, it was just a horrible experience for me reading that one of his books.
Not sure if I should thank Anne for reminding me of this, or I'd be grumpy that she reminded me of this. But Marion Zimmer Bradley's Mists of Avalon.
Oh,
is
that's big. That was the
probably
one I was going to
worst-
say. Oh,
the
gosh.
worst trash I've ever read in my life. It's terrible.
It helps that she's a monster.
It's yeah, that is also true. If you don't know anything about that, you probably don't want to know about how terrible a human being she is.
Or
but
was.
that's
Thank
worse.
God.
Yeah, but that book is god awful, and absolutely one of the most subversive things you could think of.
Yeah, that's a pretty troubling piece. And that was the one I was going to. Now I'm going to think of the other person. And you already mentioned Pullman. Oh my gosh, there was one other one that was bothering me, but it'll come to me later. So, well, I'm just, you Miss of Avalon.
It's a good question. Thanks.
Yeah, but it's just a touchstone for us. Okay, and I've been using Golden Compass on radio appearances for years. Like, okay, this is how Hollywood hates us.
Yeah, it is. And, the Pullman stuff, I mean, when it made me so angry. So why tear down Lewis? I mean,
Pullman's example is a good one because it's a readable series, right? You can read it and get through it and think this is kind of decent, but it is so subversive at the end, and that is one of the things that I think is what the movement is reacting to. Is they're trying to package up a turd in a way to get you to think it's something else, but at the end, even as shiny and polished as it is, that's what it is underneath. But sometimes you have to point it out to people, and you have to give an alternative, which is part of what we've been trying to do.
Okay, we're already over, but
Yep.
I think somebody had one question in the back. You've had your hand up like 10 minutes ago.
I think I made a really, really good point when you mentioned culture class. Dr. Pearl Princess of Mars and an incredible scene, I still think it's one of the best things, where the titular princess is given an active scene to green for aliens or human civilization, but horrible. And the elders are nearly one of her arguments, removed by it. But before she can finish her speech, a young Gray stands up, knocks her down and laughs, and the elders who are staring dirts and daggers at this guy have to sit down and take it because in their culture, might make right, which is the exact counterexample of what you're saying with good culture. But then, of course, John Carter stands up and trashes the guy, and they honor him. Under their laws, they award him the weapons of the warrior to defeat. And in this sequence, and you see things like the Sprout novel, this sequence really emphasizes to me, you see a world where the culture is obviously imperfect. It's not what we call Western culture that's superversive. But you see that there are elements of good in these people.
Mhm.
And this will come up again in the novel because these aliens are becoming allies at some point and help him. And you get the impression of a world in which a one exceptional man can make a difference. The John Carter has one advantage, he's got super strength. But everything else about him, his fighting skills, his perseverance, are well within the realm of the normal mortal man in the real world. And it's not something, it's the character, of course, but the superversive element is to be found in this world that despite the fact that it's flawed and imperfect, very much like the one we know, it still has enough good in it that you can put your shoulder to that seesaw and if you shove hard enough, you can tilt it in the right direction.
You almost said better than I did when I was describing Arthurian legend, because it's the same thing, right? Arthur and his knights are the guys who are fighting a world that believes might makes right, and they are fighting it with might. That's how they are winning and proving their point. Also, I'll just note, I think a good spot maybe to end us on, that you can never go wrong saying that one of Burroughs' scenes is the best in all of fiction.
That was a great scene. Yeah.
Thank you all very much.